Welcome to the 12th District. I'm Kerry Condata. Well, the session has ended. It's over. Lawmakers have completed their work in Olympia in 105 days with 2 minutes to spare. And in the process, they created a new budget that is 18% larger. They added $7.5 billion in spending, which is $72 million a day added for every day they were in session. There's also some significant policy bills that were passed that we'll talk about shortly, but it is over. And they did complete it with 2 minutes to go to midnight on Sunday night. We'll give our lawmakers a break this week. They need it after being up through the entire weekend. We'll have them back next week to discuss the session. For today, we're going to look at the bills that made it, the policy bills that didn't. We'll discuss a little bit about that budget and how much it's going to cost you, and then some things that are probably coming in the near future. Also, at the end of this show today, some very important information on how you can take part in the Liberty State Rally. You've heard about the 51st state. Well, it's growing leaps and bounds. That movement, particularly after this session, has gained some momentum, and there will be a rally here on May 11th. We'll tell you more about it at the end of the show. All right, we're going to look at the top 10 policy bills when we return to the 12th District. Welcome back to the 12th District. Well, again, the session has ended with a lot of work being done, some good, some bad, who knows. There's a lot here to look at. We're going to talk about policy bills first today, even though the budget has been the dominant discussion. The policy bills were significant as well. Let's take a look at the top 10 policy bills that passed in this particular session. First off, the first of its kind in the United States, human composting is now legal in the state of Washington. We're the first state to do so. For those of you that have been around a while, you might hearken back to 1973 and the movie Soylent Green. Had a very similar story, but this is not science fiction. This is actually science, and it's here in Washington State. They claim they can compost human bodies into very good soil in a very short period of time. I'm not sure what to think of that one. Number two, one of the most controversial bills of the year was the vaccination exemptions, I should say, that were changed in the state of Washington, and the personal exemptions for measles, mumps, and rubella have been removed. They are no longer legal to use those exemptions. They did keep religious exemptions remain in place, and also medical exemptions will remain in place. But this is a fairly major change, and it is a big concern to a lot of folks that have questions about vaccinations and how effective or how dangerous they may be. Studies around the world show that there may be something to the fact that we have a high vaccination rate, but also a high infant mortality rate in terms of developed countries. We'll do more on this on another show. Number three, the clean energy bill. Well, this is the one that Governor Inslee really needed because he hasn't been able to move any of his clean energy legislation over the past several years, and now he's running for president. So they gave him this little jewel. It is going to raise energy costs, according to most calculations, by between 10 and 15%. That includes natural gas and electricity and any other related energy. And what it does is basically phase out all coal energy by 2025. And you say there are no coal plants. Well, there is one that's phasing out that'll actually be closed within a year in Centralia, but that is gone. It's as good as gone. So why would we even be concerned with phasing out coal? Because we buy coal from other sources like Montana, from other outlets and other PUDs that do have coal-fired. That will go away completely. We will not be able to purchase that power by 2025, just about 6 years from now. And it will phase out all carbon emissions by 2045, which would include natural gas as well. The idea is to be carbon-free by 2045. The fact is, this state is the most energy-efficient, carbonless producer in the world. For the amount of power we produce, we have nuclear, we have hydroelectric, we have solar, we have wind. Our coal plant, as I said, is nearly gone, and a few natural gas plants. But the fact is, we are one of the cleanest power producers in the world, and why you'd want to levy a cost on people that do the right thing, I will never understand. I don't think that was a good choice, but it's certainly political. Daylight savings time. This one's not so controversial and a surprising move. The Democrats, Republicans, Senate, and House came together. I think it was nearly a unanimous vote to keep us on daylight savings time around the clock. Now, 30 other states are considering a similar proposal. It's interesting. Ours is done, but when you stay on daylight savings time, you must have congressional approval. This will have to go to Congress to see if they approve it. The other states would have to do the same. If we were to stay on standard time and not use daylight savings time, we could have done it here in the state without congressional approval. But we're going the other direction, and with congressional approval, it looks like you will not be moving your clocks forward and backwards in the future in Washington state. Well, let's get back to the controversial piece, or several. The presidential primary was moved up. Again, we believe this has a lot to do with the presidential intentions of Governor Jay Inslee, who's running. By moving this primary from May to March, it certainly gives us more influence. I believe that's true. The earlier primaries do have more influence on the final outcome, but it also technically allows Jay Inslee to run through the primary. He potentially could drop out and still run for governor. The fact is, the filing period was in May, and by moving the primary up till March, the backstory is he could, if he doesn't do well in the primaries, he could bow out and come back. And I have not heard anybody state that they're running for governor yet, which is a little bit suspect at this time. Also controversial in that presidential primary is that you will have to pick a party, either Democrat or Republican. The parties themselves will put the names on the ballots, not the Secretary of State. So basically this primary is paid for by the state but run by the parties. And that information will be kept. If you designate a Democrat ballot or Republican ballot, that information will be kept. However, your vote, who you decided to vote for on that particular slate, will not be recorded. That has become very controversial. I assume there will be continued debate on that issue. Well, a bill that had been around for a lot of years that never could quite get over the edge did pass this year. It's called Smoking 21. What that does is raise the smoking age to 21 for the folks in Washington state, but it also includes vape and e-cigarettes, which was quite controversial. Now you say this seems like a no-brainer. I mean, a lot of folks believe smoking is very bad and the age should have been raised, but the problem was revenue. The state could not afford to give up the revenue the past few years because they weren't in a, well, frankly, they were in a position to do it, but didn't want to. This year, the revenue was so strong that they felt they could let it go. It's a pretty substantial amount of revenue. However, I tend to think that most of those kids between 18 and 21 or even younger will have availability of those cigarettes with a tax or without, but that black market will probably flourish, I would assume. All right. Next one, number 7. This is the public option for health care. There is a bill that passed that will allow the state to set up its own health care program, a public option, which will be administered by a private company. It's a public-private combination. But what most people think this is a setup. It's moving towards single-payer health care, which is what the state of Washington has stated, the Democrats have stated they want to have. And though this is one step closer, it will, however, require larger subsidies. So there is not really a financing method in this. This says set it up. It doesn't say how they're going to pay for it. It will have to be paid for at some point. And it also reduces reimbursements to doctors, which concerns many people, that particularly in rural areas, that health care will not be available on that plan, or that providers will be very few and far between. We're going to take a quick break and come back with the last few policy items. We're going to take a look at the budget, and then we're going to go on and talk a little bit about that rally on May 11th. That I think most of you will want to attend. Welcome back to the 12th District. We're discussing some of the major policy items that were passed in this particular session. We will also talk in a minute about some of the major policies that did not pass. Let's go on with the ones that made it. Next on the list is statute of limitations. This one was a hard-fought bill for many, many years. I was involved in this bill early on. This increases the statute of limitations for basically for sex crimes against children, because children sometimes don't report till much later in their life the situations that might have occurred earlier in their life. Therefore, the statute of limitations typically had run out. There was a large group of folks from across the state, including folks right here in this valley, that really pushed for this over a period of about 6 years, and it has finally become law to extend the statute of limitations on child sex crimes. I think that was a very good move. All right, another controversial bill, and this one's going to have big repercussions. Tenant protections, a very controversial bill that changes the relationship between landlords and tenants. It extends the eviction notice time from 3 days to 14 days. In other words, it takes 14 days after notice to evict somebody. It changes the way the judges can, the power of the judges to decide whether an eviction is legal or not. For any reason, they can say no. People could potentially stay in their homes without paying rent. It also says that you cannot be evicted for not paying fees. Now, that's not the rent, but any additional fees, I assume homeowner fees or garbage or whatever, is now no longer a reason for eviction. Basically, folks, this is a huge protection clause for tenants and a very problematic situation for landlords. It was primarily driven by Seattle area folks. It was certainly not promoted by the folks in Eastern Washington. All right, and there's more, and the big one. Right at the end of the session in the last night, they did something that I think will set race relations back about 20 to 25 years, maybe further, in that affirmative action is back in force. Now, this is an interesting bill because it wasn't a bill. It was an initiative to the legislature, and for a moment, let's review what those initiatives do. When an initiative has enough signatures to go to the legislature must have a hearing and then decide whether to pass the bill or put it on the ballot. The other option is to offer an alternative bill that can go side by side on the ballot. Those are the only three choices the legislature had, and rarely do they approve a bill. Generally, it goes to the public. And this particular affirmative action bill, they approved narrowly, but did get it out. This brings back affirmative action for government, schools, colleges, and that sort. And as you know, and most people know, the reason it was overturned originally by initiative is because it creates a backwards affirmative action basically creates backwards discrimination to some effect, and frankly, it hasn't been needed. The colleges have been very well balanced and have proven that they've had a very diverse population. But here it is again, and there are a number of groups that have filed a referendum already. They're getting signatures to overturn this and put it back the way it was under I-200 so many years ago. I hope that they are successful. I think this, again, sets race relations back. It was a problematic idea back in the old days, and today it's certainly not needed. And the last bill, probably, again, a very controversial bill that kind of flew under the radar screen. This is Senate Bill 1575 that basically does an end around the Janus decision. The Janus decision was a Supreme Court decision that allowed people basically to back out of their union dues. It gave them the right to say they did not want to put money into the unions for political use if they didn't agree with that political use. A local group, the Freedom Foundation, it's a statewide group, I should say, has been very effective in getting that news out to folks, and the unions were losing thousands upon thousands of donors to their causes. Therefore, the political money was starting to dry up, and that political money is used about 90% to support Democrats, particularly in the Seattle area. And so the concern was they couldn't afford to keep hemorrhaging members, so they did a bill that makes it much, much tougher to get out of paying dues. It makes it much easier to form a union, and a number of other things that basically tries to do a complete end around a Supreme Court decision. I'm not sure this will be tested in courts. I think it might. I'm not so sure it'll hold water, although there are mixed feelings about that. All right, let's take a look at a couple of the bills that didn't make it. A good bill that I think a lot of you are concerned about is data privacy. This has been discussed for the last several years because of all the data information that is collected by Google and other firms and then used for various, or sold or used for various items, advertising and such. There was just not enough agreement to figure out how much data should be collected or how much should be restricted. The big companies were there in force with their lobbyists, of course, trying to protect that information because it's very valuable. And in the end, they could not come to a conclusion that would satisfy all sides of the agreement. This is not a partisan issue, frankly. It has been pretty bipartisan, but the problem is the devil's in the details is getting it done correctly so that it works the way it should. Well, as you know, the death penalty did not make it through in legislation, but it really didn't matter because it's still in effect under executive order from Jay Inslee, and also the Supreme Court recently had a finding that more or less stopped the death penalty here in Washington State, but they did not have the votes to put it in statute, which is very interesting, I must say. Low carbon fuels, wow, we dodged a bullet on this one, folks. This would have added substantially to the cost of fuel with a very, very minor reduction in carbon emissions. This one just about made it. It was very, very close, but got kicked out right at the end. And the combination of that and the gas tax failing will keep our energy costs, well, they're not low. We're some of the highest gas prices in the nation. And we'll talk in the next few minutes about another gas tax. But those two together would have added up to 40 cents on a gallon of gas, and both of those are gone. All right, last but not least, one of the biggest hearings of the year was on mandatory sex education, with a mandatory curriculum for kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, but primarily aimed at kindergarten through 3rd grade. Very controversial curriculum, and a lot of people, hundreds and hundreds, showed up for the hearing. That bill's been set aside, but guess what, folks? It's not done because it's turned into a study. That's what they do with bills they can't quite get over the hump. We'll talk about a few more of those in a minute, too. So mandatory sex ed will be back, I'm sure, in the next session. But for now, it's not happening. All right, let's take a brief look at the budget. We've already talked quite a bit about it on this show. $52.4 billion, $7.5 billion in increase over the previous budget. That's 18%. That is huge. And it includes about $1 billion, just a little less than $1 billion in new taxes. Now, the House version was much higher than that. The Senate pared it down. The taxes that did end up going through were B&O tax changes for a select number of businesses. About 40 different categories of business will have a substantial increase in their B&O tax. An increase in the excise tax for more expensive homes. Now, what they did here is they lowered the lower rate for homes under $500,000. The rate went down by 0.1%, just 0.1%. It stays the same from $500,000 to $1 million, but for homes $1 million plus, it's going to go up by double and triple depending on how much you're paying. So a small reduction, 0.1%, to help sell the bill, to say it was a tax cut for folks, and then double and triple for the more expensive homes. That's going to bring in about, I think, $1 billion in the long run. That's a big one. Capital gains tax was shelved. No official carbon tax, but the Clean Air Bill will increase the cost of energy. No retail gas tax, but as I mentioned earlier, there was a wholesale gas tax. It's called the Matka tax. There's a backstory behind this one, folks. They increased the Matka tax to put more money into the Clean Water Fund because the Clean Water Fund had been swept into the operating budget year after year. It wasn't getting used for clean water projects. Well, some were done, but the bulk of that money keeps getting swept into the operating budget, primarily to pay for education, and therefore they increased the tax on a barrel of oil to up that fund, and I'm not so sure it won't be swept again. So don't expect cleaner water just because you're paying more for gas. This will raise the price of gas between 3 and 5 cents, according to most folks. All right, and if we take a short look into the future, we can see that they did a study on breaching Snake River dams. They did a study on income tax and tax structure. They did a study on environmental justice. That was a big bill that did not make it through. Basically, that is a socialization of money, of income. And then the sex ed study we talked about previously. One note for our area on the budget that's interesting. The Fish and Wildlife Department came up $7 million short again. Now, we only spend 1% on natural resources in the whole state, which is ridiculous. I think that's below any other state in the union. And so Fish and Wildlife came up $7 million short out of a $52.5 billion budget. We couldn't find $7 million for Fish and Wildlife. It's going to create some real problems in that department. But guess what? We gave $6 million to the Department of Revenue to collect those new taxes we just talked about, and $2 million for the income tax study. I think that's a bit of a problem with priorities. Well, there you have it, kind of an overview of what happened. We're going to come back and talk about the rally, the end of an era, and a couple other things before we go away. We'll be right back with the 12th District. Welcome back to the 12th District. Well, the session has ended, work continues, but I missed one particularly significant item that's going to affect all of you. It's something we've talked about quite a bit on this show, but the folks in Olympia saw fit to raise the property tax lid, the levy lid, on schools from $1.50 to $2.50. They did it in just the last few hours of the session. And the fact is that is a significant increase in property taxes for everyone if they're voted in. Now, some of those levies are in place. Some will have to be voted. But frankly, this is the end result of going backwards on McCleary. This is not the right thing to do. The courts will probably weigh in. There is significant concern about that because the whole idea of McCleary was to move the tax or move the funding to the state level and away from local levies. Well, if the state needed more money for schools, they should have stepped up and paid for it. They did put about $3 billion in education in this budget. If they needed $4, they should have done it. Instead, they raised the levy lid on local levies, which will cost you up to $1 per thousand on your home. Means if you have a $500,000 home, you're looking at a $500 increase per year. Not to mention, they also did not retain the $2.40 state level. It went back to $2.70, so you can add another 30 cents per thousand on your property taxes. So look, folks, bottom line is we're going to see significantly more property taxes in the state of Washington. Just be careful how you vote when you get that opportunity. All right, I told you there would be a chance to maybe rally about those issues and all the other issues that happen in this session. There are a lot of folks that aren't very happy with the way things are going. Seems like the Seattle crowd is running our state, and there are many folks across the state, not just in Eastern Washington, that don't feel very comfortable. But Eastern Washington is starting to do something about it. You've heard about the 51st state, the Liberty State, and that organization is growing leaps and bounds. They are having rallies all over Eastern Washington, and there is one this May 11th, this Saturday, May 11th, at the BPOE Hall, the Elks Hall, on 27th South Chelan. That's 27th South Chelan. It'll be at 2 o'clock. It might be of interest to you if you're very concerned about the direction things are going in Washington State. This is certainly an option that is worth talking about. It's something that's been talked about for years, but given the strong left move of legislators in Seattle, it may become a reality more so than we think. So again, you may want to attend at the Elks 27 South Chelan in downtown Wenatchee. That's 2 o'clock, May 11th, Saturday. Yours truly will be speaking. It'll be my first public speaking engagement since I left office, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of the reasons we may want to look at other alternatives to being under Seattle rule. All right, on a personal note, the end of an era for sure. Frank Chopp, Speaker of the House, stepped down at the end of the session. He'll be replaced by the Speaker Pro Tem temporarily until a new speaker can be selected. Now, as I've stated before, I don't believe this was totally voluntary. I think they had the votes. The Seattle legislators felt that Frank Chopp was holding them back from moving their agenda. He has been very good politically in terms of knowing when to hold them and when to fold them. He's been very successful in keeping the power in the Democrats' hands for years by doing that. But I think that gatekeeping is coming to an end, and we might see a much more significant shift to the left under two new possible speakers. It will either be Lori Jenkins of the Seattle area or Monica Stonier of the Vancouver, Washington area. Both, I can tell you from working with them, are significantly further left than Frank and probably will not be much for gatekeepers. So if you thought this last session was pretty tough, it could get a lot worse. We could see a lot more Seattle influence and a lot less gatekeeping. And I think that, again, is pushing people to look at other alternatives like the 51st state or some other method of getting control of this state back into the hands or back into the middle somehow politically, at least to the middle. Well, that's it for the 12th District. This is Kerry Condata. We'll be back next week with your legislators. Mike Steele, Keith Gaynor will be with us to talk about their experience in the 105-day session, give us a little feedback, and maybe also tell us a little bit about what's next, because they're facing some daunting problems moving forward with that budget. Some significant deficits, particularly if Boeing has any more trouble, and it looks like Boeing is in some trouble, and that revenue could be a very big problem for Washington State. We'll talk about that and a lot more. We're going to have J.T. Wilcox. We'll have Andrew Barkus to talk more about housing. We'll have lots of great guests in the next few weeks. We're done with the session for now, but we're not done with the 12th District. We'll be back next week. This is Kerry Condata. Thanks for listening.